The Blackmagic Pyxis is an extremely riggable 6K RAW shooting camera with a fantastic price point, but should you get it if you film weddings or corporate or commercial videos, etc.? And the answer is, it depends entirely on you and your filmmaking style. In this video, I'm going to review the Pyxis and talk about the filmmaking style that I think would work best with this camera and help you decide if you should purchase it. I also want you to know that I've put together a free wedding filmmaker gear guide that's going to share with you all the equipment that I recommend you use for wedding filmmaking. This guide is completely free and linked in the video description. Also, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Blackmagic. They just reached out to me and said, hey, we have the new Pyxis. Do you want to borrow it for a month? And I said, great. I've seen a lot of people talking about this camera and I would love to check it out. That said, this video does have a sponsor and it's my friends at Track Club. Track Club is my go-to choice for music licensing when I need to heavily customize a song and make it sound exactly as I need it to. Let me explain. A couple can tell me that they want a song that sounds like Ed Sheeran for their wedding video. I can use Track Club's similarity search feature to find a song that sounds like Ed Sheeran, and then I can use Track Club's exclusive Mix Lab feature to remix the song, adjusting the volume for vocals, muting the drums, giving the track a completely unique sound that I can then download and use in my video. This is revolutionary for music licensing, and you can check out Track Club for yourself and get a 2-month free trial at the link in the video description. Now, when the Pyxis arrived, in a big box was the camera itself, which is really just a box with a sensor, side screen, and a lot of mounting points. And this really leads me into talking about the first and main filmmaking style that you're going to need to adopt if you want to film with the Pyxis. This isn't like the Blackmagic Pocket 6K or other cameras that you may have used in the past. This is a camera that comes as bare bones as possible, and it's up to you to build it out in the way that you see fit. In short, if you are not a filmmaker that enjoys building out a rig and tinkering with it to get the perfect position and layout for you to film with, this is not the camera for you. That's why Blackmagic makes the Pocket 6K. With that camera, you can throw a lens on it, toss in a battery, and you're good to go. But you do that with the Pyxis, and it's going to be a pain to hold because it's really just a box. And if you needed more of a clue, on the box it comes in, Blackmagic calls it the world's most riggable camera. So keep that in mind. If you're someone that wants to build out a rig and use a lot of support gear, you are going to love the Pyxis. Now, personally, I would not consider myself someone that commonly builds out big camera rigs. I film weddings and I want to use as small and lightweight of a setup as possible because I'm going to be using them all day. So I'm naturally gravitating towards smaller mirrorless cameras like those from Sony that give me a very small footprint. But I wanted to give this camera a chance and experiment with rigging it out. So I reached out to my friends at Condor Blue, which, by the way, I make a set of audio cables with them, which I would highly recommend checking out. I'll link to them down in the video description. And Condor Blue sent me an entire cage for the Pyxis, as well as a carrying handle. Plus, I also had some other rigging gear like these rails here, etc. So I was really able to build out a nice feeling shoulder rig setup for this camera. Notice that I also had to use a V-mount battery to power this whole system because this camera is so stripped down, it doesn't even come with a battery in the box, just an AC adapter so you can plug it into a wall. It's funny, that's exactly how I had to use the camera for the first week of testing it because while it takes BPU batteries, I didn't have one of those on hand, and I look at the prices and I'm like, $400 for a battery, what? No. So decided to just wait for Condor Blue to send me accessories to power it. Anyways, once you get this camera rigged out, I have to say, that's when I, who regularly uses small mirrorless cameras, started to really get it, because big rigged out cameras like this are really cool. There's something really impressive about this setup. And if you show up to film with a client and you have a rig like this, they are going to be impressed and they're going to think that you're a professional and the money that they've spent on you is totally worth it. It's kind of like filmmakers putting a matte box on their camera lens. I have friends that own a matte box just for the purpose of putting it on a camera to impress their clients. They don't even put any filters in it. They just want to make their cameras look bigger and more professional so the clients think that they're getting their money's worth. And a matte box is a relatively cheap way to do that. Never mind that you can get similar video quality from a smaller rig. That doesn't matter. What matters is that whenever you're filming on a corporate or commercial set and the employee of the company that hired you is standing right behind you watching you and they say, oh wow, that's a cool camera, they feel more confident in their choice to hire you. And I think that that really leads into us talking about the price of the Pyxis, which is not something that I usually do until the end of my reviews, but in this case, the reason that the Pyxis turned so many heads and had so many filmmakers talking about it whenever Blackmagic announced it earlier in 2024 was due in no small part to the price, which is in short, incredibly aggressive for this style of camera. Come back in time with me now. The year was 2009, and I'd been filming with a Sony Handycam video camera for a couple years, and I was looking to upgrade. Spoiler, I ended up purchasing a Canon 7D as my first DSLR. I filmed my first wedding a few months later, and that was really my genesis as a professional filmmaker. Back in 2009, though, before I had purchased that Canon 7D, I remember talking to many of my filmmaker friends about how rumors were circulating that Red, the camera company, was working on a dramatically cheaper and more affordable camera, with the main pitch being that it'd be a 3K resolution RAW filming camera that would only cost $3,000. 3K resolution for 3K. Of course, we know that never ended up happening, but here we are about a decade and a half later, and Blackmagic shows up, announcing a camera that is not 3K for 3K like the rumors I heard back in 2009 said. No, this new camera would be 6K for 3K. Yes, 6K resolution in RAW for $3,000. That sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it? And whenever you consider that if you want to purchase a riggable camera like this from the competition, you're looking at spending significantly more money, you can start to understand why Blackmagic turned so many heads whenever they announced the $3,000 price of the Pyxis. It's pretty darn awesome, and this is really filling a niche that people have been asking for, which is why filmmakers were so excited about it. But as I said earlier, whenever you buy this camera, it just comes with the camera in the box. There's no battery, there's not even really a way to hold it comfortably, meaning that you are going to need to spend more than that $3,000 base price to get it ready to film with. And then, once you get it fully rigged out however you like, you need to consider that this is still a camera with quirks and limitations like all cameras. So now that we've gotten past the build out and rigging of the Pyxis, let's talk about its other features and what it's really capable of as a filmmaking camera. To start, if you've used another Blackmagic camera like the Pocket 4K or 6K or the Ursa, the Pyxis is going to feel very familiar to you because it has a similar menu system, similar buttons, similar interface overall, and I think that once you learn it, it's a really good set of camera controls. It's also really well built with a very solid feeling construction. If you had to use it as a weapon, it would work really well as a blunt object and keep filming while you defended yourself with it. The main limitation that you're going to need to work around, though, when it comes to rigging, is that the main screen of the camera is permanently built into its side. This means that unlike a mirrorless camera or the Pocket 6K, which you can point directly at your subject you're filming and watch the screen as you are filming them, you're going to need to turn your camera to the side while filming if you want to use the screen. This isn't a huge deal, especially if you wanted to use an easy rig, because you could have the camera turned on its side as you were filming on the rig and still be able to easily view the screen. But for any other rigging situation, you're going to either want to mount an external monitor to your camera or use something like the Blackmagic EVF that they sent me over to test with this camera. The good news is that Blackmagic has announced an external monitor that has all of the touchscreen controls and capabilities made specifically for the Pyxis, but unfortunately it was not available at my time of recording this review, so I have not been able to test it. But considering how much people love Blackmagic's other external monitors, I'm betting that this one is going to be good as well. In addition, the Pyxis also has an SDI out on the back, so you can use an external monitor with that as well. As far as memory and storage goes for the Pyxis, I'm happy to tell you this camera has two CF Express Type B recording card slots, and you could also plug in an external SSD to the USB Type-C port and record to that as well. But unfortunately, while the dual CF Express cards can be hot swapped for continuous recording, they cannot be recorded at the same time for backup recording, which feels like a weird omission and something I would definitely like to see Blackmagic add in a firmware update. Regardless, it definitely feels like Blackmagic wants you to record to an SSD if possible, because considering how little they included this camera in the box, they still saw fit to include an SSD side plate for you to strap an external SSD to for storage. Back to the limitations of the camera now, keeping in mind that Blackmagic really wanted to hit this $3,000 price point, it's no surprise that the Pyxis does not come with built-in ND filters. Nope, unlike something like the Pocket 6K Pro, which has them included, if you want ND filters, you're going to need to add them to the end of your lenses yourself. Speaking of lenses and talking lens mounts for a moment, there are actually a few different flavors of lens mounts you can choose when purchasing your camera, including Canon EF mount, L mount, or PL mount. Personally, I wanted the L mount version, and even though I do not own any L mount lenses, I was able to reach out to my contacts at Sigma, and they were kind enough to send over one of their new 28 to 105mm f2.8 lenses, as well as a 35mm f1.2, both of which are beautiful lenses. Thank you, Sigma. They were very nice to film with. Thankfully, too, the Pyxis has an active L mount, meaning that all of the lens controls worked, like aperture adjustments, etc. But there is one feature that I wish this camera had in regard to lenses, but none of the other Blackmagic cameras have it as well, and I'm sure you can guess. It is continuous autofocus, or the lack thereof on this camera. With the Pyxis, you can press the autofocus button on the side of the camera here to adjust its focus, or you can even use one of the programmable buttons on the lens to do that. But there is no continuous autofocus here. No face or eye or animal or bird or plane autofocus. Just press the button to adjust focus one time, and that's it. And this is a bummer because we're living in an era where autofocus systems for video are getting extremely good from companies like Sony, Canon, and even Panasonic. And this is really an area where I feel like Blackmagic is starting to fall behind. Now, I'm sure the argument could be made that this is a cinema camera, and cinema cameras don't need autofocus. There's going to be a dedicated focus puller on set. But in my experience, many of the budget-conscious filmmakers that are looking to purchase a Pyxis aren't going to have a dedicated focus puller. And in addition, this argument of not needing autofocus really starts to fall apart whenever you consider that you have companies like Sony putting really great autofocus in their cinema cameras. And Red cameras have had autofocus for years as well, meaning that it really feels like an area where Blackmagic is starting to fall behind. And I would love to see them invest in some research and development into giving their cameras a great autofocus system as well. For now, you just need to be aware of this limitation, and if you are considering buying the Pyxis, because I still think that it's a great deal as a camera, especially considering the video quality you can get from it, it is lacking certain features that its competition already has. Speaking of video quality now, let's talk more about that. The Pyxis has essentially the same sensor as the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, meaning that it is a full-frame sensor with 13 stops of dynamic range that can record 6K at up to 60 FPS and 6K open gate at up to 36 FPS. Just like with pretty much all other modern Blackmagic cameras, the 12-bit RAW footage from this camera is completely gorgeous, and I don't think you'll have a problem getting a fantastic looking image from it, especially with the amazing color grading tools in DaVinci Resolve. I really love how this footage looks. But that said, there is another big limitation of the sensor that we need to talk about, because just like how there's no continuous autofocus, there's also no in-body image stabilization either. And yet again, I'm sure I will hear an argument saying, Matt, it's a cinema camera. They don't have in-body image stabilization. But that argument doesn't really work for me either, because Sony recently introduced the Burano, a cinema camera that notably costs over 8 times more than the Pyxis, but it also includes in-body image stabilization. And you cannot tell me that Sony is not planning on introducing this IBIS technology into future versions of their cinema cameras as well, which is going to help drive the price down lower to something where you may consider purchasing one of those cameras versus the Pyxis. My point is, this is just another area where I'd like to see Blackmagic work on this specific technology, because I want to see their cameras improve and get better, and I bet you do too. Side note, by the way, while the Pyxis does not support in-body image stabilization, like many other Blackmagic cameras, it does support gyro stabilization in DaVinci Resolve, meaning that the camera has a gyroscope in it that saves information on the camera's position like pitch, tilt, and roll to the metadata of the video clip, and that information can then be used to help stabilize the footage in post. In my testing, this can help the footage look better, but it still can't compare to having dedicated in-body image stabilization in the Pyxis. Moving on, let's talk about Lowlight Performance. The Pyxis sensor is a dual gain ISO sensor, meaning that it looks best at a lower ISO of 400 or a higher ISO of 3200. And while this is nowhere close to something like an FX3, for example, which has a second base ISO of 12,800, I found that I was comfortable pushing the Pyxis to about ISO 6400 before it got too noisy. To be clear, the camera will let you go much higher, all the way up to 25,600 ISO, but there's going to be a lot of noise in the footage, and you're going to have to do some noise reduction magic to attempt to get it to a usable place. So in short, if you were thinking about buying a Pyxis, you're going to need money for rigging, and you're going to need money for lights, which, to be clear, I always recommend you buy lights, even if you have a camera that performs extremely well in low light. Next, sticking with the sensor, let's talk rolling shutter, because that was definitely a concern that I've seen brought up a lot online whenever this camera was announced. Whenever I first turned on the Pyxis and it was set to record 6K in OpenGate at 24 FPS, I started moving it around a bit and looking at the screen on the side, and there definitely was some rolling shutter visible. And if you're someone that films in handheld, let's say in a shakier style, especially in 6K OpenGate, this may be an issue that you have to deal with. Thankfully, if you film in a lower resolution, the rolling shutter will not be as bad, and personally, I'm someone that prefers to film with smoother camera movement and less shake, so I'm not as concerned about this, and I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker. But going back to what I said at the beginning of this video, this is a camera that's going to work great for a certain style of filmmaker. And if your style of filmmaking is a ton of camera shake and whip pans back and forth, you definitely may notice some rolling shutter. Next, what about audio? Well, I'm happy to tell you the Pyxis has one mini XLR input on the front that you can use to rig up a microphone with phantom power, as well as a 3.5mm TRS input as well. So while you're not getting dual XLR inputs like you would on certain cinema cameras, considering the Blackmagic was trying to keep the price down, this is not surprising, but you will need to keep it in mind if you're wanting to do something like run dual microphones for an interview where two people are speaking, etc. Anyways, let's go back to the question I brought up at the start of this review. With a fantastic price of $3,000, should you buy the Pyxis, especially if you film weddings or corporate or commercial videos, etc.? And like I said, it's really going to come down to you and your filmmaking style. If you are someone that likes to build out a bigger cinema camera rig and you're okay with building out a shoulder mount or using an easy rig, etc., especially if you want to impress your clients, that's where I think that you need to heavily consider the Pyxis, because it's coming in at a great price. Come on, 6K resolution for $3,000, it's fantastic. But I still want you to be aware of the limitations of this camera that Blackmagic had to implement to hit this price point. There's no continuous autofocus, there's no in-body image stabilization, there's no ND filters. And when it comes down to it, if you are either not interested in spending the extra money to really rig out this camera, or you are like me and you prefer to film your videos with a much more stripped down and minimalist setup, that's where I have difficulty recommending the Pyxis. And instead, if you're okay with using a camera that does not have internal RAW, but still comes with significantly more features like autofocus and IBIS, etc., I would instead look for something like a Sony FX3, which you can pick up for about $3,500 used these days, or $3,900 brand new. And if you consider everything that you're going to need to purchase to rig out the Pyxis, like an external monitor, easy rig, batteries, etc., you're looking at a very similar price anyways for what is, in my opinion, a more complete package in the FX3 that also happens to be better in Lowlight too. To be clear, it will not look as impressive as the Pyxis is fully rigged out, but if you buy something like Caleb Pike's Camera Foundry Cineback kit, you can probably get it pretty close. Speaking of pretty close, if you would like to get pretty close to booking your next wedding film, I would highly recommend watching my free wedding film booking workshop. That's going to show you how to book your next wedding in 30 days or less. This workshop is completely free and you can watch it down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know your take on the Pyxis down in the comments below, and have a great day.